I haven't used this for ages, it's great. Hello and welcome back to Automotive Tales. On today's episode, I'm going to do some whiteboard stuff. Now, I've never done this before, so bear with me, but there is a question that's been raging on Twitter about whether it is better to replace an existing internal combustion engine or ICE vehicle with an electric vehicle or BEV, EV, whatever you want to call it, based on its carbon emissions. Now, this question came up as a result of a car that is potentially being scrapped under the scrappage scheme under ULEZ. Before you jump into the comments and give me absolute death, I understand that ULEZ is not about emissions, it's about air quality locally. However, my point was, in this particular instance, with a very low mileage car that's doing very low miles every year, it isn't a one size fits all. There's definitely a case for somewhere where an internal combustion engine vehicle is better than an electric vehicle based on the fact it's not doing a lot of mileage, and if it already exists, then its carbon footprint is already spent so far for its production. It makes no sense to spend that carbon footprint again to produce a new vehicle if it's got a limited lifespan or a very low mileage expectation. So there's a lot of confusion around this. So I thought what I'd actually do is use our whiteboard. We're going to do some maths, we're going to do some carbon accounting, and we're going to try and show that while there is a break-even point at which a battery electric vehicle is the right thing to do for the environment, we all understand it's the right thing to do for localised emissions, but for the environment as a whole, which is really what we're ultimately should be worried about, is what the impact is of the environment. We shouldn't be doing things that are going to ultimately disadvantage the environment. So we're going to start to look at electric vehicles, we're going to start to look at internal combustion engine cars and start to count those up. Then we're going to look at the very specific case in question and show why the kind of common logic of, well, yes, an electric vehicle is better for the planet than a internal combustion engine vehicle doesn't always stack up. And you and me as the consumer need to be savvy about these things because it isn't a one size fits all. And actually, we shouldn't be trying to do things in the name of being better for the environment that actually ultimately aren't better for the environment. So everything needs to be considered in a case-by-case basis, and we as a consumer have just got to get better at understanding exactly the impact we are having on the planet. So let's first of all start with some numbers. Okay, so the first thing we want to look at is manufacturing. So I'm gonna do two columns. I'm going to do one for battery electric vehicle, which I'm going to symbolise here with a hammerhead eagle eye thrust. And those of you that have watched Top Gear will know what that is, because hiding behind here on my whiteboard is the old Top Gear cool wall. So I've chosen the only electric vehicle I could find on there for that, and something that's roughly equivalent to the vehicle that we were talking about, which was a Suzuki Wagon R Plus, which is the vehicle that's potentially being scrapped. I found a Peugeot Bipper. It's kind of about the same size type of vehicle, so we're going to use that to represent the car that I'm talking about. So let's first of all talk about manufacturing. So when you manufacture a vehicle, there is a carbon footprint associated with that in mining the raw materials, the critical minerals, moving those to where they need to be manufactured, the processing that happens on that, and then the physical assembly of the whole vehicle. And that also includes then moving the vehicle to where it's going to be sold and consumed. So we have some figures from the internet, and I'm going to link all of the stuff that I'm using below so you can go and interrogate it yourselves. And there will always be a bit of a range to the numbers. I haven't spent hours and hours and hours preparing for this because I simply haven't the time. But I've taken some reasonably reliable numbers from the internet, which is about as reliable as you might want it to be. But we're going to use them as a start for 10. They're all fairly credible sources. So the first one, manufacturing of a battery electric vehicle. That is roughly 8.8 tonnes of CO2 equivalent for the manufacture. And then for an internal combustion engine vehicle, it's about 5.6 tonnes CO2 equivalent. Now, obviously, in between these, there's things like plug-in hybrids and hybrid vehicles. And I've tried to use the same source for these, so it's a like for like. Obviously, if you're manufacturing a very large vehicle, like a Range Rover, that's a big V8 petrol, then chances are that number's going to go up. And if you're taking a very, very, very small EV, something like the size of a smart car, that number might come down. But that is comparable in this instance. So what we see there is a difference of about, I think it's 1.57 times the CO2 emissions before we even get started. So this is at 0 miles. So let's think then, okay, throughout its lifetime, this vehicle, the electric vehicle here, is going to produce significantly less emissions because it's using electricity, and the electricity grid produces less emissions than making power from an internal combustion engine because, well, even though we're running mainly on gas in the UK, we're still significantly more efficient. So we know roughly what the CO2 emissions are for a internal combustion engine car. I've actually gone and found the emissions for the vehicle in question. So we're talking about, it's actually about a 98 to 2000 era Suzuki Wagon R. It's actually a Wagon R Plus. And the range of emissions, so it's 143 to 166 grams. Now that's grams per kilometre as it's specified. So a quick conversion into grams per mile, and that's approximately 237 to 275 grams of CO2 per mile. So we're going to use the worst case scenario here for the internal combustion engine, 275 grams per mile. So now we look to the electric vehicle. This gets a little bit interesting. So I've baselined on a Honda E, which is kind of the smallest EV I can think of. It's kind of comparable in size, I think, roughly to the Wagon R that we're comparing over here. So that has a 35.5 kilowatt hour battery. That battery gives it a range of 137 miles, as stated in its brochure on Honda UK's website. So if we convert that all the way through, that is roughly 0.257 kilowatt hours per mile. Now, obviously, we want grams of CO2, so now we have to make some assumptions. So what is the CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour? That varies vastly in the UK. So let's take a bit of a kind of a worst case, best case, and let's go somewhere in the middle to give it a fighting chance. So worst case scenario, well, not even worst case, average in 2021 was roughly 265 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour on the grid. And on a very, very good day, in fact, today is an exceptionally good day. I checked today and we're actually at 56 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour on the grid, because we're in the middle of summer, we've got lots of sunlight, it's quite a windy weather at the moment. So gas plants are basically down to a minimum, coal is off, we're using very little over from the continent. So it could be as low as that, but this is quite rare, and obviously only during the daytime when we've got solar, relies on good wind. This is the average from 2021. We've improved since then, I think. So I think we should go somewhere about in the middle. Let's call it roughly 150, because give or take, it's about smack in the middle. So grams per kilowatt hour. So that's the number we're going to go with, because that is about average. I think you're going to be nearer to this number. I know when I checked, I think it was last night, we were running at about 200 overnight because we've got gas and coal online. So if you were charging a vehicle overnight, you're more likely to be at this end of the spectrum. But go on, we'll give it 150 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So what does that mean for the little Honda E? Well, that is therefore going to be, hold on, I need to look at my notes, 38.85 grams of CO2 per mile, which is the number we are interested in. So now we've got a like-for-like comparison. And this is where we can see an EV is a lot better mile for mile than an internal combustion engine, but it still has a footprint. It also has a massive footprint up here that we've got to basically consume, or we've got to offset. Now, that footprint never goes away. So if you built both vehicles and you did 0 miles in them, this is obviously worse for the environment. But if you're going to take a vehicle and do thousands of miles in it, then chances are you're eventually going to overcome that. So with these numbers, I want to have a quick look at what point that tipping point is. So we're going to do some accounting, and we're going to go up in, I'm going to say 10,000 mile increments, and see at which point the two things balance out, and then everything past that, it gets better for an EV. Then I want to look at the case in point, which is about a vehicle here that actually does very, very low mileage, and a vehicle that already exists. So this has already been accounted for, it's already been put into the environment. Replacing it with something new, if this still exists, well, you're adding all of this in before you even start your small per mileage input. So let's go and do that first. Right, so I have drawn some axes on here. So we've got tons of CO2 up the middle, going up in 10 tons at a time. And we've got internal combustion engine on the left, battery electric vehicle on the right. I've just cleared off the previous workings to give us a bit of space to draw on here. So first things first, let's look at manufacturing. So manufacturing, that's going to be 8.8 tons, about there, 8.8 for battery electric vehicle. And then over here, it's 5.6 tons for the ICE. So very clearly, there's a deficit here. So let's go 10,000 miles down the life of the vehicle. So 10,000 miles at 275 grams of CO2 per mile gives you 2.75 tons. So that's quite a reasonable amount. That gets you up to 8.35. So that total there is 8.35 because you're adding 2.75. So getting very, very close already after only 10,000 miles. However, if we do 10,000 miles in our B.E.V. at 38.85 grams of CO2, we're producing 0.3885 tons. So it's quite a small amount, but that takes us up to 9.18. So you get a little slither on top of there, and the total of that one is 9.1885. So in total, after 10,000 miles, it's still better for the environment to run an internal combustion engine vehicle than a battery electric vehicle. So let's go another 10,000 miles down the road with this old Suzuki Wagon R. We're putting another 2.75 on there because another 10,000 miles at the same, and that brings us to a new total of 11.1 tons of CO2. So it's jumped quite far ahead. We're going to do another 10,000 over here as well, which brings this up to a new total of 9.577. So we've seen after 20,000 miles, then very, very quickly, the internal combustion engine has now produced more lifetime emissions than the electric vehicle. I'm not going to consider end-of-life emissions. I think there is more of a burden for recycling a battery electric vehicle than there is for recycling an internal combustion engine vehicle, but we'll park that for now. We're just interested in its sort of through life, what the consumer immediately sees. So what we're seeing here that is, if you're buying a vehicle brand spanking new and you were going to go and buy a Suzuki Wagon R, if they still made them, that would be great, wouldn't it? Versus a Honda E, it would only take, it's probably just over 10,000 miles, probably about 11, 12,000 miles, before every mile you do is going to be less polluting than that of the EV. So it makes sense. If you're going to buy a new car and you're going to do lots of mileage in it and you've got the facilities and you can afford a modern electric vehicle, then really that's the way to go. But now I want to reset this graph, and we're going to look at the case in point with this car, which has lived in London for all its life and is now going to be potentially scrapped, and what the effect will be if that consumer was to buy an electric vehicle or be allowed to continue to use the Suzuki Wagon R. Right, we're back at the board. As you can see, it's miraculously cleaned off. And now we're going to look at the case in point. So we've got a vehicle that is 25 years old, that's done 7,000 miles through its life. That equates to about 280 miles a year. So that vehicle is already in existence. This 5.6 tonnes of manufacturing is already spent. So the question is it better to get rid of this vehicle? And we're going to ignore the impact of scrapping the vehicle, what that means in terms of emissions. It's only going to make things worse, but let's ignore it for now. Do we purchase a new electric vehicle and continue to do very low CO2 mileage in it? Or do we keep this existing vehicle? So if we decide to go down this route, well, we're buying a new vehicle. That's got to be manufactured. So straight away, we've got a burden of 8.8 tonnes. So that 8.8 is now on the chart. Now we're going to start doing some mileage. Let's say we do 10,000 miles in that vehicle over whatever period you wish that to be. So we know that 10,000 miles is 0.3885 tonnes of CO2 for this vehicle. And we know from the previous chart that takes us up to this tiny slither on there, 9.1885 tonnes. So this vehicle is already sitting here waiting on the driveway. Let's go and do 10,000 miles in that. So we're going to do 10,000 miles, and that is 2.75 tonnes of CO2. Let's go do another 10,000 miles. So we know that we've got another slither on there, and that goes marginally up. In fact, it actually stays below that 10 mark. It goes up to 9.577. So it's still below the 10 there. It's moved up a little bit. There you go, there's your two slithers. Another 10,000 miles over here, and we're going to have 5.5 at the total. So after 20,000 miles, we're still only at 5.5. So you can see how this is going. If we're just doing 20,000 miles, we're still not going to break even on the electric car. In fact, there's quite a way to go. So let's speed that up, shall we? Okay, so we've progressed all the way along to 40,000 miles, and we've hit 40,000 miles, we've hit 11 tonnes of CO2 on the internal combustion engine car, and we've hit 10.35 tonnes. At 40,000 miles, it's finally overtaken. So somewhere around 35,000 miles is the tipping point. However, this vehicle in question has done 7,000 miles in its entire life. Let's assume the person involved is going to live for another 25 years and continue to do mileage at the same rate, and that means they are doing 280 miles a year. So let's work out at 280 miles a year how many years it's going to take before the option to buy a new EV is better than continuing to use the internal combustion engine purely from an environmental point of view. Clearly, displaced emissions here mean this is better for ULEZ and its emissions control. But in terms of the overall environment, let's see where that tipping point is. Okay, so we've reset the graph again. We've got the 8.8 tonnes in there for manufacturing a new vehicle because, as we just said before, we can't recover that. That's already done, spent and gone. So from today, let's say we're going to do our 7,000 miles in 25 years. So what does that look like? Well, we already know it's 275 grams of CO2 per mile for the internal combustion engine vehicle, 38.85 grams for the battery electric vehicle. Now, that equates to 7,000 miles, 25 years, 280 miles a year. So for every year, it's doing 77 kilograms of CO2 over here. That's per year. And the EV is doing 10.906 kilograms per year. So clearly this is more efficient in terms of its emissions, but it has an awfully big debt to catch up on. So in this instance, this vehicle that already exists, in 25 years, doing it 7,000 miles, it's going to produce 1.925 tonnes. 1.925 tonnes of CO2, and the battery electric vehicle will produce a tiny amount because we're doing minuscule mileage. It's almost imperceptible, 0.272 tonnes of CO2. However, that is still just over 9 tonnes of CO2 versus 1.925. So this vehicle already exists, and the argument that scrapping that and moving to a BEV for this particular instance doesn't work. It's massively inefficient. And let's assume the battery electric vehicle then does get sold on, but we're talking 25 years down the line here. This is an instance where somebody's doing very low mileage, and yes, it's a very extreme example, but it's an example that exists and demonstrates it isn't a one-size-fits-all. There's a massive disparity. Going and buying an electric vehicle to replace that little old car that's running along is almost never going to catch up. In fact, so I did the calculations, to get to 8.8 tonnes on this side, that person would need to continue to run their vehicle at the same rate for 114.2 years. So what we've got is a very extreme example, but an example that it isn't always better to replace a vehicle with a new vehicle if it's still operable. Now, if this was end of life, then fair enough. You crash it, it's written off, then like for like, if you're doing high mileage, as we've seen, you're probably going to want to be over here. Likewise, if you're doing very low mileage, as we've shown, if you're doing less than 10,000 miles in a 25-year period, which is about the lifespan of a vehicle, because things start to deteriorate very quickly at that point, you're still better off buying an internal combustion engine car. So if you have a car, you need it for whatever reason, mobility, you live miles away from any sort of town, you still have to get around, but you're only doing very infrequent journeys, you're doing very low mileage, it is still better for the planet to have one of these, because you don't have this massive upfront debt of 8.8 tonnes to try and pay off. And once you get to the tip over mileage, it doesn't go away, you're still adding, it just means over that mileage, then slowly but surely this side starts to get larger. But you have to have like for like going over that mileage. If the person buying that vehicle is never going to achieve that mileage and they're going to keep that car for the lifetime of the vehicle, then it's always better to have an internal combustion engine. So the moral of that is not that EVs are bad. I don't hate EVs. I would quite like to try one. I don't have one currently. We are maybe considering one for our next house, but we do live close to a coal power station, so this number is likely to be significantly higher for us. But it isn't always the answer. It's about doing the maths, doing the thinking for your situation and understanding where you sit on this map. Has the carbon already been spent? In which case, let's not go and spend it again. Let's use what we've already spent wisely and continue to do as little damage to the environment as we possibly can. So I hope that makes sense. I've done it as more or less one long monologue, which I've now got to go and edit. So thanks for that. And yeah, hopefully it makes sense and it's useful. Feel free to comment below. It'd be good to have discussions. Keep them clean, keep them nice, keep them polite. Let's not have an argument in the comments, please. Let's have a fruitful debate. But I genuinely think this demonstrates the fact that it isn't always right to replace like for like. So, in fact, you might see over here my my fake Fiesta that I had last year, the Festival of the Unexceptional. That had next to no mileage on. That hadn't really covered its debt. So it's been repaired. Sarah has taken that on. It has now gone back on the road. It's going to be somebody's first classic, so it's probably going to do next to no mileage whatsoever, but it means somebody doesn't have to go and buy a new car. We've saved it from the scrapyard. Its debt to carbon is already long since spent. Scrapping it and buying a new car wouldn't have made sense for something that's maybe going to do 3,000 or 4,000 miles a year. Although I really enjoyed that, so I had it insured for 1,000 miles, and twice I had to up my insurance because I think I ended up doing 3,000 miles in a year in it because it was great fun to drive. But it still was better than throwing it away and replacing it. Right, that's all for this episode. I'm fully expecting to get ripped to pieces for my terrible handwriting, but hopefully the maths all stacks up. See you next time. Bye. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching. I tell you what, I have a newfound respect for lecturers at university and teachers at school. I'm doing this in front of an audience of none with a camera, albeit it's very warm in here. I am exhausted. This is quite hard work. So yeah, thank you to all those people that stand in front of lecture halls and educate us in important matters, because this is hard work. Right, I'm going to go and fix a RAV4.